Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for the third in our series of community dialogues around some great books that we can find out there. And today we're going to converse with Tayo Roxon's Use Your Difference to Make a Difference. If you missed any of the previous community dialogues, they are available on our Facebook page. You can go over there and view them at any time. But today I want to thank Aisha White, who is with our Convention and Visitors Bureau, for moderating, and welcome Grace Lee, who is with Eagles Landing Christian Academy, and Dr. Murray Williams with Southern Crescent Technical College, who is also a member of our board. So thank you all for joining us this morning. Just by way of starting, I just want to thank you all, but also say, in his book, Tayo talks about starting with reflection, and that he suggests whether it's a journal or something to that effect, but that we share these conversations and these reflections with our family, our friends, and our coworkers, and that to start the unlearning process so that we can begin the learning process and get past some of our biases and accept our privileges in that. And so I think that's a great way to open the community dialogue today. That's exactly what we want to do, is we want to have these conversations within the community with some of the great leadership that we have in the community. I would be remiss, we did have Chair June Wood with the Board of Commissioners, who had agreed to join us today. Unfortunately, she had some surgery earlier last week and is recuperating. She is doing well, but she was not able to join us. And so I want to send our thoughts and wishes out to Chair Wood as she recuperates, and hope to see her on one of our upcoming community dialogues. So again, Grace, Dr. Murray Williams, Aisha, thank you for joining us this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Aisha to start the conversation, and I will be monitoring, Gary and I are monitoring Facebook Live as well as the Q&A chat features within Zoom. So if anybody has anything to share, any questions they have, please post them there. And when I come back in roughly a half hour or so, I will share those questions in that with the great panel that we have. But thank you all again. Aisha, it's all yours.
Thank you, Joe. And once again, I want to thank you to Grace Lee, and thank you to Dr. Williams for agreeing to be a part of this conversation with me. I'm excited to dive in. I think that this title is a really dynamic book from Tayo, and I was speaking earlier with both of you all how I think that it just worked out well that he's talking about this overall cross-cultural communication, but this idea of education, and you all are both working in areas of education. And so I just want to kick off the conversation with starting with this topic of unconscious bias. So he dives into that in one of the early chapters of the book. He covers a couple different types of biases, but I just want to cover a few of them. Some of them we've heard before, just maybe in current times, and they're just better known forms of bias like microaggressions. And so I think that term has been used a lot lately, and just to kind of define that, it can be subtle terms, subtle ways of people phrasing things, but it could be hurtful to the person on the receiving end of it. I know, if someone's like, oh, well, saying that you sound white when you talk or something like that, when you articulate, different examples like that. But then there's also beauty bias or gender bias, and those are kind of self-explanatory. But there's also some terms that he used, like conformity bias, in the book. And with conformity bias, he was exploring the idea of, for this example that he used, is where maybe a whole group of people decide we want to attend a specific college, and because the group is going with that, you're conforming to the group and deciding, I'm going to go with that, although that educational institute might not have anything specifically to offer to you. And then there's also affinity bias. And with the example he used, he said he's a fan of LeBron James, Harry Potter, and Manchester United. And so he has an affinity towards other people who share those same loves. And I guess the opposite to that would be, if you don't happen to enjoy those things, then there's some sort of disconnect. So basically, we're all guilty of expressing some sort of bias towards others, or we've been on the receiving end of it. So my first question to you all would be, can you identify a time when either you were on the receiving end of bias or you expressed that to someone else? And then in hindsight, how did you feel, or how did that person respond to your actions?
I'll respond to that. This question, this whole chapter on biases was really an eye-opener for me, because I realized as I was reading it that I was doing things in my life that really were biases that I never thought were biases. And so even in thinking about this type of question, on page 15 in the book, the author makes a statement. He says, biases inform every decision we make, what we teach, who we hire, who we fire, who we promote, the marketing of programs and policies we create, and those even that we support. And he is so on point with that statement, because those things, those biases that we have, they really are directing what we do. And I thought about when I was a child. I had an affinity bias, and I didn't realize that's what it was. But I wanted my close friends to always be males. I didn't have a best girlfriend. I had a best guy friend. From first grade all the way through college, Trig Trosper, that was my best friend. And the reason as I reflected on that, I think the reason why I had this affinity towards boys is because I grew up with 8 brothers.
Wow.
And so they talked about sports all the time. I mean, I remember being a child and I carried around on paper this little grid. At the time, there were only 28 NFL football teams. But I had my little grid. I can tell you every team. I could tell you every quarterback. I could tell you every coach. I could tell you who the wide receivers were, who the tight ends were, because that was the conversation I was always around. Well, little girls didn't want to talk about football. They wanted to talk about dolls and fixing your hair and all of that. And I've never been a hair person. So I had an affinity towards guys. Even in my adult life, some of my closest friends are men. But I never thought of that as a bias, that I was being biased towards women.
Mm-hmm.
But I realize now in reading this book, I've got to fix that.
Yeah.
So that's been my experience, something I just wanted to share, because it's those subtle things that will really end up hurting relationships or keeping us from growing if we don't recognize them early on.
That's so true. Thank you so much for sharing that that story, because I know that you aren't the only one that has experienced that. And so the fact that it can open up your eyes in that area, I think that speaks to the power of the book, and just truths. Like, I felt like it was just truth bomb after truth bomb as we're digging deeper and deeper into it. Grace, can you speak to that? Any biases that you experience?
Yeah, and going off with what Dr. Murray was just kind of ending with is that it's hard with biases because we're a lot of times not aware of it, at least with implicit bias. And so it goes back to, we always have the discussion of impact versus intention. And so our intention is not to, cause harm or to make someone feel bad about the situation, but what was the impact on the other person? And I remember it was my first year here, after teaching, and I was just at a graduation party and having just some small talk with another colleague of mine, and she was just asking, "Oh, Grace, are you single?" and asking about my personal life. But then she directly asked me this question verbatim, and she asked, "So are you a US citizen?" And it took me a few seconds to process what she asked me and to respond. And I said, well, I was born here in the United States, but my parents are from South Korea. And I knew her intention was to ask, where's your family from? Where is your origin? What is your nationality? But the impact it had on me is that I immediately felt like a foreigner, and I felt different. And I reflected on, I don't know if she would have said the same thing to one of her Caucasian colleagues. And so, I just shared it on social media, and I just said, this is why cultural sensitivity training is very important, not blasting out anyone in particular. I was like, I'm thankful it happened to me as a staff member instead of another student or a parent, causing more harm. And I had another colleague write down, I was like, oh, Grace, that wasn't her intention. Her intention wasn't ill will. And so it's just being able to teach people through microaggressions and implicit bias, the proper ways to ask questions. And we were able to, I was able to clarify. I did find myself the next year, I was doing my bio as a teacher, that I explicitly put, I was born here in Stockbridge, Georgia, but my parents are from South Korea. And I reflected on that, and I don't remember clearly putting that specific bio the year beforehand, So I felt like in myself, I had to kind of, before anyone asked, identify myself as a US born citizen.
Mm.
I think there are a couple powerful things that you said there, Grace. Well, first of all, like you said, acknowledging that someone's their intent might be different than the impact that it has. And I think that often because people might say something that's hurtful to you on the receiving end, because their intent was not to hurt you in their mind, they easily dismiss it. And so people are told that they're being too sensitive or overreacting to a statement, and it's just that they're not understanding your point of view and the effect that it's having on you. And there was a second point to what you were saying. It's like lost me. I hopefully it'll come back around. Oh, you know what it was? You were saying how you had to adjust as a result of that and be intentional in how you described yourself in your bio. And once again, I think that points to, we'll talk about things like privilege later on in this discussion, but everyone doesn't have to do that. You know, doesn't have to adjust the way that they talk about themselves so that, you know, as to avoid misunderstandings in the future. And so if someone can just kind of put themselves in your shoes and see that, like, you're even having to do things like adjust the way that you talk about yourself in order to get a better outcome and how someone addresses you, if that makes sense. Yeah. He also, Roxanne, he also speaks about core values in this section when he's talking about bias. And I just made a note saying that he defines core values as your fundamental beliefs as a person. And he says that these beliefs guide your decision making. And so he breaks it down and says basically it's your heart and your mind. And if we're thinking about overall the way that we treat other people when it comes to race, when it comes to just any otherness, it comes down to your heart and your mind and what's in it, how you think, how you act, what your beliefs are. So your core values are who you are, and that is going to direct everything that you do. Mm-hmm. So moving on to the topic of education and environment, a little bit later on in the book, a couple chapters over, there's a quote, I love like pulling quotes from what he said. There's a quote he says here that says, seeing our behavior through others' eyes is a critical part of becoming more self-aware. I am such a fan of self-awareness. I think that when people can reach continuing levels of self-awareness, then it helps you to be better internally, but then also to interact with other people. And so my second question would be, if somebody is trying to reach this journey of self-awareness, do you have any suggestions as to like how you start with that when it comes to communicating with others from different backgrounds?
Yes, Aisha, I think that, I agree with the author. I think it was on page 43 of the book, and he talks about being that active listener. You know, and when he's talking about being that active listener, he's talking about how, you know, we have to listen to learn, we have to listen to evaluate, we have to listen to understand. And I think in so many of our conversations, we miss a very critical part of being able to communicate with other people because we don't truly listen. People are talking and to us, and then we're on the other side of the conversation. We're already formulating in our heads what our response is going to be, what we're going to say to what that person just said. And we're not listening to really grab a hold of what that person is trying to convey to us. And if we would take that posture, I think the author gives the example of taking the posture of an interviewer, where you're really listening intently, not so that you can have a comeback, but so that when that person gets through speaking, then you can ask some of those probing questions where you can dig deeper into what that person is saying, because that's where we gain that knowledge. If I'm speaking with Grace, I don't know anything about Grace's culture. So why would I then come back after she's expressed that she's from Korea? Well, you know what? I had a Korean friend when I was 2, and we did this. No, no, that's not what I should be saying. I need to be listening to what Grace is saying about her culture because she's trying to educate me. She's trying to inform me. And if I truly want to get to know her better, then I'm going to tailor my questions to what she has already spoken, not trying to add something else into the conversation, acting like all of a sudden, now I'm the expert on the topic that she's talking about, that she's been living all of her life. So I think that we have a prime opportunity to really listen and be able to learn from people as we listen more intently. You know, it's been said that we need to be swift to hear and slow to speak. And sometimes we're swift to speak rather than being slow to speak. And so I think we really need to grasp hold of that in our communications with other people as we're trying to learn about their culture and be able to relate with them better.
That's so true. That was well put. I mean, it's so true. I think to so many experiences that we have. I remember in a theater class that I had, it was that idea of when we were practicing lines and it's like time to go. And specifically, our professor was like, actually listen to the lines, because when you're trying to memorize and go off book, you want so much you're thinking about your own lines and you're not listening to the person that you're interacting with. But in order to actually have the conversation flowing and for it to feel natural for the performance, you have to actually be listening to them and be active in the conversation and not just waiting for your moment to speak. So that's beautiful. It's perfect. I love that example. I always hold that with me. Yes, so Grace, yeah.
Don't make assumptions, and because that's where the stereotypes start coming in, and then even along with that, if there's a group of people that are very different from you based off of just different experiences than your own, is self-reflect on, what do you know, who have you interacted with from that group, and what do you not know. And were those experiences positive or negative? And not saying that you have to open up a can of worms and have all of those discussion with that person, but I think as you speak is that you're trying to get a better understanding of their perspective and understanding and having sympathy and having empathy to put yourself in their shoes instead of putting your life into their story.
Yes, I agree. That's so true. Because it's so often that if someone's just opening up to you and expressing their experience, once again, people can be dismissive just because they haven't experienced it themselves. But it's like we all have different life experiences. We all go through different things. So just because it did not happen to you does not mean it's not a reality for me. So yeah, that's great. Moving on, we'll be also discussing this idea of perpetuating systems. So systemic racism, that's a term that's like, in a lot of conversation as of late. Racism didn't magically pop up, or come out of nowhere with the deaths of people like Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, but it's definitely the spotlight is on it lately with the conversation and the result. People, just being in front of screens much more often than we had been as a result of 2020 and everything that's going on here. And so it's bigger than just a single person. It's an entire system. It's been built by people. And borrowing from another quote from Tyre Roxon, he acknowledges that the issue of trying to stop perpetuating systems, it may seem daunting, or like you may have a sense of dread when you're addressing this because it feels much bigger than you. But he said, because if you look at the fact that because people are the ones who built the system, in turn, people can break it down. So that's like an injection of hope, and not to have a defeatist attitude towards this idea of having to break down this entire system. And so one of my questions that follows with that whole idea of trying to break down the system is, where does somebody begin? So when we say systems, he says that when they're not in check, the isms, the negative stereotypes and phobias that plague the world, they prevail. And so systems could be a workplace, educational institution. It could be media. And so how does one start to fight against the system? Because there may be situations where you're the only one, the only woman in a situation, the only minority, whatever it is. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak from working in an educational institution. I'm at a college, working here at Southern Crescent. And one of the things that I see on a daily basis is that we have the prime opportunity to educate people. We have to start where we are. We have to start with the tools that we've already been given. And so for a college campus, we start in those classrooms. We start having those courageous conversations with our students about what it means to be uniquely different from someone else. But not only that, but that it's okay to be uniquely different. If you've never been taught that it's okay to be different, then you don't have that frame of reference. So that when you encounter somebody else, then you think there may be something wrong. But as an education institution, we have to recognize that there are some systemic issues in our educational system. And even on our college campus, one of the things that we started doing, we started thinking about, well, because we know those issues are there, what is it that, how is it that we want our college campus to look like? What does that environment look like? How do we want our students, our faculty, our staff, our administrators? What is it that we want them to embody on this campus? So we had to start thinking very hard about that. And so we have begun the process of educating people on our campus about what it means to be civil, what it means to be diverse, what it means to be fair. One thing the media is very good at is shining the spotlight on all things negative. And the media in the last few months, not saying that we haven't given the opportunity for them to do it, but they have done a great job of shining the spotlight on incivility all across this nation. But and to the point that now, even when we're not watching the news, those images are still so etched in our minds. But the question that I have is, then who is coming behind the media and now shining a movie, playing that movie on what it means to be civil, what it means to be fair, what it means to treat people the way that you would like to be treated? If we don't begin to have those conversations, talking to people about what it really means to love your neighbor, even though your neighbor doesn't look like you or doesn't act like you, if we don't begin to have conversations about what it means to appreciate people who are different, what it means to respect people who are different, then this nation, this world that we are building is going to remain the same. And in an educational institution, we have the prime responsibility on a daily basis to talk to our students in the classroom, to have engaging conversations with faculty and staff, to model what we believe we want people to see even through our administrators. And so I think we have a prime opportunity to just change the narrative and be able to arm our students, our faculty, our staff, our administrator with the tools that they need to really be able to fight this battle that we now see ourselves facing.
That's wonderful. And I think that that's an advantage to the students from diverse backgrounds, because it can give them confidence in that area and not feel like an outsider. But then also it's equipping students that maybe from an area where they are not used to seeing people that are different than them, and equipping them with education and tools to be able to better communicate with those groups. And Grace, I'm sure that with Eagles Landing Christian Academy that you are coming across that same type of thing where you are promoting differences and tolerance within environments. If you want to speak to that.
Yes, and that's directly my role, serving as director of diversity. And so we have these conversations. While I'm not a teacher in the classroom, we do have a student diversity council and a parent diversity council. And I love sharing about our student diversity council with those that are not familiar with our community, because we allow the students to have those conversations and to share their story. There's so much power in when an individual can share the things that they've gone through, the highs and lows, and just to listen, as we were talking about, listen to hear, not listen to judge, but just listen to understand that this is someone else's unique experiences. I may not have had the same, but I need to honor, and I need to value, and I need to respect that person and give them dignity. So what we do with our students in Diversity Council, so similar to what Dr. Murray was saying about having those conversations in the class, is we have culture talks. So with our students, we meet on a monthly basis and we give them an opportunity to share anything about their life. It could be based off of their cultural background. It could be a specific interest or hobby that they have. So some of the things that our students have talked about, one student's talked about trading stocks at 4 o'clock in the morning with people in Australia. And that's actually why he was on the football team for our school. Then he quit football because he was up so early trying to trade stocks. And yeah, it's just so crazy. And it's like he was doing that as a junior, and his goal is to have $1 million, you know, through stocks. So like, you go, better than I mean. And another student that just got his pilot license, so talking to us about the 101 about aviation and the different planes and how a plane is safer than being in a car. Another student talking about, she was one of my executive board members the first year we had our diversity council, and how she was from Mexico, and she was just very vulnerable and shared how actually she moved from Mexico to the United States because there was a ransom put over her head. And there were local gangs that were out to get her personally. And so it's scary. And to another student being able to share how she was adopted from China and having her mom in the room and just letting her be so proud. That's always my biggest mission here at the school, is that I want, if I could have one individual student when they walk out these 4 doors and they go out to college, that they feel more confident in who they are and they're able to share their stories, I've done my job. And then 2, so kind of switching to, I looked up some statistics, and as we were talking about the book and battling racial discrimination in the workplace, it's more marginalized for people of color. So nationally, so these are stats from the DC Policy Center, and the Black unemployment rate is 2 times the white unemployment rate nationally. But in DC, it's 6 times. So the Black unemployment is 6 times greater than the white unemployment. And students that graduate with a college degree in DC who are Black are 3 times more likely to be jobless than their white peers with the same degree. Mm-hmm. So we talk about, oh, I'm not, you know, maybe a lot of conversations that we've had this past summer is that I'm not racist. You know, these are not my issues. But I think people need to acknowledge, while you may not see yourself as racist, there are systems and there are institutions all around us that are perpetuating the injustices towards a certain group of people, whether it's LGBT, whether it's specific gender, what's a certain race, color, ethnicity. And so I think it's just being able to acknowledge and being more aware of the different systemic racism that we face in our society today.
That's so true. Thank you so much for that added information. I think that is really impactful, hearing those numbers. And it's just so interesting to me. You know, you are, I'm sure, part of educating students is preparing them for the workforce. Mm-hmm. And it's like, how do you balance that, where you're trying to encourage them to go out into the world, but also the acknowledgement that, hey, because of your skin tone, you may be less likely to be able to get employment, whereas, you know, your peer, they might not have that issue. So that's a delicate, I think, thing to have to balance. But I commend you all both for being able to, you know, to tactfully, you know, go into those areas and speak with whether it's children or adults in the educational fields and be able to tackle that, because that's huge. I had a question about the idea of tolerance in students, but I think it's really was encompassed in these great answers that you both gave me. So I'm just going to move on to this idea of privilege and allies. And I just wanted to kind of note this. I know there are sentiments when it comes to things like these book talks, because just book talks in general, I think that when handled different ways, it can feel like a box is checked off, or it's just like, oh, that was a great feel-good conversation, and now we go back to our normal life and not have to deal with it But if you are a person of a specific group and other, then you live it, and you don't get an off day. You don't get a chance to tuck it away. And so I think that has to be acknowledged. And these book conversations are just a piece of it. It's just the tipping point where we have these conversations and we start, and at least people are hopefully gathering some sort of direction, and we can move from there and take action. And that's where privilege comes in, and people recognizing the privileges that they have, and being able to use your privilege to be an ally. And so allies, according to the book, are defined as people from dominant groups who actively work to tear down oppression. And then oppression has to do with the forces that use power dynamics to limit opportunities and growth for people of different groups by systematically taking away their identities and their power. So my question to you is, once a person becomes aware of the different privileges that they might benefit from, how do they use that position to help people that may not benefit from the same privilege? And, you know, I don't know, an example might be if you are a part of like the dominant religion in your region, or if you're the dominant race, or different things like that. Oh, a powerful example that Roxanne gave was that this world is created for right-handed people. There are left-handed people here, and you know, it's like we don't hate left-handed people. We just hadn't considered them in creating these systems and how things work. And I think that's like the clearest example that you can think of when you think of a dominant group of people and the minorities that are within it. And it's not, and they may go, well, I don't hate you, I don't, you know, dislike you, but it's like, you didn't consider me though. You didn't consider how my life is different or altered. We have a left-hander here in the office, and like sometimes life's more difficult for her because we're like, oh, we didn't think about that with scissors or whatever it is, you know? And so I think that's like a really great example that's easy for people to digest. I'm sorry, I digressed a little bit, but yes, the question is, once a person becomes aware of their privilege, how can they become an ally? How can they help others that don't benefit from their privileges?
Well, Aisha, I think they have to be, that person with the privilege has to be willing to open up their mouths, take a stand, let their voice be heard, let their influence come out that they have in order to be able to help another person. As I thought about this particular question, I thought about this book, and I don't know if you read it or not, but the book is called The Same Kind of Different as Me. And it's about this successful businessman who he actually meets this homeless person through his wife serving at a community center where the homeless normally come in order to eat. But because of their difference, one was white, one was black, one was privileged, one was not, they were able to overcome their biases. They were able to overcome their cultural differences. And they began to go all across this nation, speaking about the homeless, trying to fight for rights for the homeless, to the point that they raised over $85 million to support homeless people. So here you have this man who definitely used his privilege in order to help those who were not privileged. That's what we have to do. Just like in the examples that you gave, if you're the dominant religion, but yet you see other religions not being treated fairly, you don't sit back and remain silent. You stand up and you have a voice so that you can help those who may not be getting those same privileges, because the privileges that are out there are meant for all of us to enjoy. But unfortunately, history has shown us that not all of us enjoy the same privileges, but we should have the opportunity to do so. So I think it comes down to us being willing to tear down some of these barriers, tear down some of these walls that have been built up over the years, and then really be able to stand up for our sisters and our brothers so that we can all be able to participate in the same things.
Very true. Very well put. Thank you.
That was so powerful. I don't know if I can really stop that. I just really just drops the mic and walks away. But along with that, you know, just is being able to use your voice. And I think, you know, even for youth, you don't have to have a degree, you don't have to have a certain status or title in order to make a difference. And I always think about just simply volunteering. So if you have a heart, we all have a heart for something. If we sat down here and talked about our stories, we have a heart to serve. And with privilege, I always say, you are blessed to be a blessing to other people. Your privilege is not just for you to be successful in this world. Your privilege is used to be able to impact and give back to other people. That's one of the reasons why I'm in education, in particular secondary education, is I did not see myself, maybe kind of on a tangent, but I did not see myself reflected in leadership when I was a student here. I'm also an alum of Eagles Landing Christian Academy. And at that time, I graduated in 2008. I was one of maybe about 10 Asian students here at the school. And when you look at secondary education, only 2% of educators in elementary school are Asian. And so I wanted to change that paradigm. And I wanted my students to see themselves through me. Being a preschool teacher and having a student that is half Caucasian, half Asian, for me, it pulled my heartstrings. Because it was like, I didn't have access to that until I didn't have someone that looked like me in leadership until I was in college. And so, and just speaking up for the marginalized, being able to use your privilege, not just for yourself, but to better the communities around you.
That's very true also. I love the examples that you gave, and being able to, once again, inspire the youth. You know, the world is very much so in their hands. They're, carrying our, past mistakes and all the things we've done, and, like they're burdened with that and helping to change the world continuously, as time goes on. And so being able to equip them and give them that confidence that, that you matter and that they can change the world in these different ways is so important. So I love that. Also within that section, speaking about privilege, we also encounter that idea of intersectionality and understanding that. So in order to define intersectionality, I pulled his definition, and that is the theory that the overlap of various social identities such as race, gender, sexuality, class, contribute to the specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination experienced by an individual. And he has a quote here that says, understand that people are not monoliths and avoid using simplistic languages to define groups of people that might share a particular social identity. On so many levels, people can just group different people together and paint in really, really broad strokes and assume that because you appear one way that that's the beginning and end of it, without an understanding of the ways in which your life intersect. There might be obvious things. I say I am a Black person and I am a woman, but if I have a disability or other things that you cannot see, then you're not aware of that. But this is different ways that my life intersects. And so that brings me to my next question, which is, how does intersectionality, or where does it come into play when discussing matters of diversity, equity, inclusion? How can people apply this theory to their day-to-day lives? How do people keep intersectionality in mind?
Well, I think, Aisha, that it should always be at the forefront of our conversations. So many times we look at each other as if we're one-dimensional. You're only a woman. There's nothing else that people can see past the fact that you are a woman. So because you're a woman, you may not be able to do A, or you may not be able to do B. And I think when we think about ourselves as multi-dimensional human beings, and that we have so much more to offer than what you may be able to see on the surface, I think your example, even with somebody with a disability, is so relevant, because sometimes we look at people with disabilities and then the first thing that pops in our minds are limitations. You can't do this, you can't do that. And that might be the very person that you need in the room. That may be the very person that you need to have at the table because of all of these other things that that person have going on. But if we never sit down and have a conversation to really get to know that person, to really get to see how multidimensional that person is and what they can bring to the table, then we're not going to be able to really advance our culture and advance our communities the way that we need to. So we need to always have this theory of intersectionality at the forefront of our minds so we can try to understand exactly who's sitting down at the table with me. Because even as I sit here and I interact with you and Grace, I'm asking myself, oh my goodness, who am I really talking to? Who am I really communicating with? What is Grace really all about? You know, because there's so much more to Grace than what I've been able to even meet or see in these few minutes of conversation. There's so much more to you than what I've been able to gather out of this conversation. And so until we really start digging deep and acting like we're onions and start pulling back all of the layers of who we really are, then we're not going to be able to really move forward, I think, in a way that we genuinely want to do, not only in Henry County, but in society as a whole.
Yes, perfectly put. And I agree. We are complex people. So the fact that anyone can try and, you know, boil us down to one thing and paint in broad strokes when referring to any of us is just unfair and unrealistic. So,
yes.
Grace, how do you think that people can apply this theory to day-to-day life?
Yeah, so going off with what Dr. Murray is talking about is that you just have to get to know people genuinely. You know, when we just go based off of stereotypes, and even sometimes too, I find myself and I catch myself like, oh crap, like talking about Koreans as well. And I always preface with my students, like this is a general, but I am making a broad stroke. So I do, you know, preface that beforehand. And that's just the way that we put labels on people, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And that's just based off of our own experiences, based off of things that we've seen in media. Can we control that? I think we can. The more self-aware that we are about it and the more conversations we can have like this, that's where you can start seeing the change. But if you just kind of like, okay, this is what I believe about this group of people and that's it, and you don't question why you have those assumptions and are those positive or negative, then that's where we're going to continue having systemic racism, whether people realize or not that they are part of the problem. One thing that I wrote here is, you know, with intersectionality, I think it's being able to create a pipeline of mentorship and promotions for people of color, or for any groups that are not represented in. So if you're the CEO of a company, you find a lot of your, you know, executive officers or in the roles are all males, you need to create a pipeline to have more females. The world is becoming more diverse. And it's going to continue being like that. And it's going to continue being like that for the generations behind us. So we're not preparing ourselves if we're just going to keep being cookie cutter. These are the group of people that I know. These are the group of people that I'm comfortable with. And, you know, there are people that do that. I'll be just frank. We have a lot of diversity here at Eagles Landing Christian Academy. And there's people that come to our school for it. And there's people that may leave our school because of it. And for me personally, sometimes it makes me sad because I feel like that's not the world that we're in. We're not in this bubble or this monolithic society and perspectives. It is a beautiful tapestry of just celebrating differences. And so I think the more that you can address and become aware and acknowledge some of these biases and prejudice and where these intersectionalities, the positive and negative aspects of it, is where we can truly find change. And then two, you know, I'm always about like the research and the stats. So according to World Economic Forum, so people of color who experience microaggressions in the workplace are more likely to quit. And I know, like, even we talk about here in Christian schools, talking about, okay, let's get more people of color as staffs. Like, okay, that's fine and great, but how are you going to keep them there?
Right.
Because there is a high turnover sometimes if they feel like they're not part of that community. So what type of culture do you have at your school? And do you have a certain accent at your school? If you do, you need to change that accent.
Wow. Aisha, don't tell Lincoln, but I think this is probably one of the greatest conversations we've had in this dialogue series. I love the fact that you all have taken us from biases to intersectionality to allyship. And I think whether we're talking race, whether we're talking differently abled, whether we're talking religious beliefs, which we still hear a lot of bias out there on that, LGBTQ, anything that's out there, we need to address it again as a country and as a world, as a global reality, because what we're seeing, especially with the last 6 months, our worlds have changed considerably. And the fact that now we're having this discussion via Zoom, everything's happening electronically, and we're all across the world. We're across the globe. Who knows how far out in the solar system we're getting, but these are the new realities. And the fact that we can come together and have these conversations with our unique backgrounds, with our unique understandings, but respecting each other to have these conversations is what's amazing to see happen. I do want to pull us back into the biases, and I opened with Tayo saying, you know, start with a journal, start with reflection. And I found that as I've begun this journey through reading up as we plan out the community dialogue, that I have, you know, much like Dr. Murray said, I've got my biases. I don't think I do, but boy, I just realized I had another one. And so I have to stop and I have to think, how did that get there? And what do I do about it? And I think as Aisha and I were talking yesterday about many of these topics within the book, that's, I think, where we start looking is okay, here's the bias. What do I do about it? And so I think that's where I'd like to have a little bit more conversation for those that are joined us on Facebook Live and on Zoom, is we can't stop and pull, you know, put our head in the sand because we have a bias. We realize we have a bias. I accept that bias. We're gonna get past that bias, and I'm gonna apologize. So what are some of those things that we can do rather than feel guilty about having this bias? What are some of the thoughts that we have that people can own that and move on? How do you know, Grace, you had shared, let's volunteer. So I love that because that's getting engaged locally. And if we feel that we have a bias against a certain segment of the population, then maybe I need to work myself into volunteering there and realizing what I had that bias for. What are some of the thoughts about these biases? Because yes, we all have them. And if we don't own them and change them, where do we go from there?
I know I can speak to just in my own experience when we're looking at like affinities and the different things that I can say, oh, I enjoy these different activities or types of music or something along those lines, and making the assumption that because making the assumption that somebody else wouldn't be into that same thing, or the fact that because we don't have a point of connection. And I can recognize that there are times where I kind of shut down and are like, I already know I can't connect with you, so I'm not going to try. And that's like the opposite of communication. It's terrible. But like that's a reality of it sometimes, where you look at the situation, what seems to be obvious, and go, well, we won't have anything in common. And rather than trying to find a point of connection, something in common, you'd rather go separate ways. So that's something I can think of in my own life.
I think for me is just being very intentional, Joe. I grew up very introverted. And so I found myself when I got into higher ed, especially, and had to go to meetings, I would go, my president might send me to a meeting in her absence, and I find myself over in a corner somewhere because I didn't see anybody in the room that I felt comfortable being around. I think we've got to get to a place where we move out of our comfort zones. We've got to be willing to go a little bit further, even if we feel uncomfortable, even if we're not accustomed to interacting with these individuals or with this particular organization. I think we're going to have to put ourselves out there on the forefront and be willing to be vulnerable, to be willing even to be hurt for the greater good. Because if we stay where we are, we're not going to make a difference. And we've got to ask ourselves, what is going to cause the greater impact? Me being silent, or me opening up my mouth, or me taking a particular action? What is going to have the greater impact? You know, we've all heard this phrase about how it takes a village. Well, I think in this whole conversation of diversity and inclusivity, it takes a village. It's going to take all of us. It's not going to work if the people on the right side of the street, or as in Aisha's example, the left-handed people are the only ones who are willing to make a difference, rather right-handed people say, oh, we're fine. No, we're not. All of us have our biases. All of us have to examine ourselves, and all of us have to be willing to do something to make things better. And that's going to cause for change, and it's going to cause for action.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And I know we've been talking more about like implicit bias, but of course, you know, there are some explicit biases. So kind of going back to what Dr. Murray was saying, is you explicitly, when you go into a group setting or in a meeting and you take specific actions, okay, I'm not as comfortable with that group of people, so let me gravitate towards, I know for me, like maybe people of color or other females or other people with the same faith. And I think sometimes that happens is because we fear the unknown. We fear what we don't know. And so when you become more comfortable in those settings and you're more aware, you can go into any room. And now I can go into any room and I can speak to anyone from preschool up to the president of the university, because those have been my interactions since college and since higher education. And so some tangible things, there's a test, I don't know if you guys have taken it, it's called the implicit association test that's conducted by Harvard. Yes, and so had our staff go through that, and I made a lot of people very uncomfortable because it's not saying that you explicitly prefer one group over the other, but we have reflexes and just automatic responses to things where we're just unaware of it. So it just brings to light some of those things. And then one book I wanted to recommend when it comes to biases that I'm reading right now, and it was recommended to me by a colleague. It's called Blind Spot: Hidden Biases of Good People by Grinward and Banaji. And it's very theory oriented, and I love it because it's all of these things like, oh my gosh, like who knew about this? And the same thing, and a lot of it is focused on like the implicit association test that is conducted with Harvard. But I love what everyone is talking about, is getting outside of your comfort zone, is being very intentional, and being able to volunteer. I think those are great action steps that we can all take.
Thank you, Grace. I think you and I are going to be great friends between the statistics and data and the theory, and I'm quite the data geek, so I look forward to further conversations with you. I think as we get close to the hour, we're at about 10:52 with a couple minutes left, and if nothing else, I hope this whole piece wraps up for anybody that watches it, that this will cause discomfort. The only way that we can change is to go through discomfort, and that alone is that wake-up call that we need. We all have our biases, but we all have things in common, and that's where that intersectionality comes into play. Dr. Murray spoke about being an introvert, and Aisha and I'm going to out you, Aisha, but she and I can both understand that, and we laugh about that a lot of times in the office. We'll talk about introverted experiences that we've had. And it is tough, and especially when you're an introvert and you see yourself as different, whether it's gender or race or religion or any of that. Because growing up, that you were seen as an outsider, or you felt yourself as an outsider because that was the way it was. And so I think even to this day, there are certain groups in that I'm not comfortable with. And that's where this looking at the intersectionality and seeing what we have in common often is more than what we don't have in common. And it's really more of who I am those things that you can't see on the surface than you can see on the surface. And I think that's where we look at those allyships and say, I'll just share a bit again about yesterday's conversation that Aisha and I had. We were great in celebrating 100 years of women's right to vote. But if women didn't have that allyship, then they wouldn't have been able to make that change. And in the last couple of decades, the LGBT community has made significant strides in equality, but they wouldn't have been able to do it alone unless they had the allyships. And we need to be able to bring these allies together to make it successful. And I think, when we look at the anniversary of Colin Kaepernick taking the knee for the national anthem yesterday, but it was also the day that many of our professional sports teams boycotted any games that they were playing in response to the unrest that we're seeing throughout our social norms. And so these are people that we normally wouldn't see as allies. And I think it's amazing that now this country and different aspects of this country are waking up to that. It's going to be tough to have conversations with those that refuse to wake up or don't see it as an injustice. But beginning the conversations like we all have done today and we've done in the past, and we hope to have further ones, and really seeing and hearing from Dr. Murray and from Grace on what firm pieces are being done within the educational system, because like it or not, that is one of the areas where it does where some of these biases begin. A lot of it begins at home, but some of it begins in the educational system. And we see the haves and the have-nots, and we see different dynamics break that down. So to hear from you both on some of the great things that you're doing, I am so excited to hear that for the county, for our region. And I think that we're definitely in good hands with the work that you two are doing and a lot of that. And Aisha, I will leave it up to you to close us out if you'd like. And again, I want to thank you all for participating. And for anybody that's watching this, thank you for at least having an open mind and sharing a commitment to understanding more.
Thank you so much, Joe. I did want to make a note to Grace, what you were saying about the implicit bias test. If anyone's interested in taking it, it's implicit.harvard.edu. And so people can access that and take advantage of that. And I think we basically covered, all that we wanted to accomplish within the hour within this book. But I highly suggest this book, Use Your Difference to Make a Difference, by Tyler Roxon. He is a consultant and podcaster. He's got a TED Talk you can find online on YouTube, which speaks to the art of diplomacy, and it's great. And that's how I first found out about him and followed him from there. And the book goes on to talk about implication, how you can apply these theories and these ideas to the actual workforce or educational institute, and so that it is not only conversation but action. And I think that's overall what we're trying to spark is action in the end. So thank you, ladies, for chatting with me. Thank you so much. I enjoyed all of your insight. It was beautifully put, and I'm excited that I had a chance to talk to you all, and you all were able to share your ideas.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
You too. Thank you all very much.
Bye.